Today, February 28th, 2026, the United States and Israel launched coordinated military strikes against Iran in what President Donald Trump confirmed in a video message is a major combat operation, with explosions reported simultaneously in Tehran, Isfahan, Qom, Kermanshah, and Karaj, with Iranian state television broadcasting footage of smoke rising across the capital. With Israel declaring a nationwide state of emergency and closing its airspace to all civilian flights, with hospitals including Sourasky Medical Center, Sheba Medical Center, and Rambam in Haifa moving operations to underground fortified facilities, with Iran retaliating within hours by launching missile strikes against Israel and targeting the United States Navy's 5th Fleet headquarters in Bahrain, with a person killed by shrapnel from Iranian missiles in Abu Dhabi, marking the first confirmed fatality of the retaliation, with Iraqi and regional airspace closing across the board, and with Trump telling Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps commanders to lay down their weapons or face certain death, while Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu said the operation would last as long as needed. And within hours of all of this, the question every government, every central bank, every energy trader, every supply chain manager, and every household on the planet is asking is not who struck what or whether the military objectives were achieved, but what happens to the global economy in the next 72 hours, because the answer to that question determines whether this becomes a contained military operation with painful but manageable economic disruption, or whether it becomes the beginning of the most consequential regional war since 1973, and the starting point for any honest economic analysis of today's events is the Strait of Hormuz, the narrow 21-mile-wide waterway between Iran and Oman, through which approximately 21 million barrels of oil pass every single day, representing roughly 20% of the world's entire daily oil supply, a waterway that is now surrounded by an active conflict zone on its northern shore, because Iran retaliated against American and Israeli strikes, not just by launching missiles at Israel and Bahrain, but by signaling through its Supreme National Security Council that all American and Israeli interests across the entire region are now legitimate targets, which means every supertanker transiting the Strait of Hormuz in the next 72 hours is transiting through a declared free fire zone on the northern flank, and the maritime insurance markets that priced that risk moved within minutes of Iran's retaliation announcement, because even a partial disruption of Hormuz transit, not a full closure, just an elevation of maritime risk sufficient to redirect supertankers around the Cape of Good Hope, adding 10 to 15 days to every delivery, adds $3 to $5 per barrel in freight costs immediately, and triggers precautionary buying from every major importing nation simultaneously. And energy economists have modeled Brent crude moving through $90, through $100, and toward $120 to $130 per barrel under a scenario where Hormuz disruption lasts more than 30 days and a full closure, which Iran executed partially during the tanker wars of the 1980s and has threatened repeatedly since, would remove those 21 million barrels from daily global supply with no short-term alternative, because the Strategic Petroleum Reserve holds approximately 350 million barrels, representing less than 17 days of global consumption, because Saudi Arabia and the UAE hold spare capacity of roughly 3 to 4 million barrels per day that takes weeks to bring online, and because Iran's retaliation today already demonstrated it retains missile capability sufficient to strike targets across Qatar, the UAE, Saudi Arabia, and Bahrain simultaneously, meaning the Gulf energy infrastructure that represents the world's only meaningful short-term alternative to Hormuz transit is itself now within the declared target range of Iran's armed response. And here is where the economic cascade becomes mechanical and unavoidable, because oil is not a commodity that sits in isolation from everything else. Oil is the energy input that underlies every product manufactured anywhere on Earth, every kilometer of transport for every good shipped anywhere in the world, every household in Europe, Asia, and North America that heats with natural gas or drives a gasoline-powered vehicle, and a sustained oil price shock of the magnitude that Hormuz disruption produces does not transmit gradually through the global economy. It reprices everything simultaneously in a single, violent upward movement that monetary policy cannot address quickly enough to prevent real damage, which means the inflation that central banks spent 3 years fighting back from the 2022 energy shock does not creep back gradually. It returns in a single session of energy futures trading, and the Federal Reserve, the European Central Bank, and the Bank of England are all now confronting a scenario their models hate most: an inflationary shock they cannot fight with interest rates without simultaneously crushing the economic growth that is already fragile across every major Western economy. And beyond energy, the conflict has immediate supply chain implications that extend far beyond oil, because Iran's missile retaliation targeted Bahrain, Qatar, Saudi Arabia, and the UAE simultaneously. And those 4 countries host approximately 40,000 American military personnel across Al Udeid Air Base in Qatar, Naval Support Activity Bahrain, Ali Al Salem Air Base in Kuwait, and multiple facilities in the UAE. And every American ally in the Gulf is now simultaneously absorbing Iranian missile attacks and deciding in real time how much of their sovereign airspace and territorial waters they can commit to American military operations without becoming a primary Iranian target themselves. And that calculation is being made right now by governments in Riyadh, Abu Dhabi, Doha, and Manama. And the outcome of those calculations determines whether the American military operation maintains the regional access it needs to sustain strikes against Iranian territory, or whether the coalition of Gulf partners quietly narrows in the coming hours. And then there is the decision that may matter most economically, China's decision, because China imports approximately 11 million barrels of oil per day and sources the majority of that supply through the Strait of Hormuz, making it the single nation most acutely exposed to sustained Hormuz disruption. And China has maintained diplomatic relationships with both Iran and the United States that give it a potential mediating role no other power currently possesses. And China's belt and road energy investments across the Gulf represent hundreds of billions of dollars of infrastructure that a widening regional war directly threatens. And whether Beijing decides to exercise its unique leverage to push both sides toward a ceasefire, or to step back and allow the conflict to develop, will determine more about the next 90 days of global economic stability than any decision made in Washington or Tel Aviv today. And the financial markets already understand all of this, which is why Asian trading tonight and European trading Monday morning will be the most closely watched market opens since March 2020, with energy futures, gold, defense industry stocks, airline stocks, shipping insurance rates, maritime freight indices, treasury yields, and emerging market currencies all moving simultaneously in directions that reflect not just today's strikes, but the entire decision tree of the next 72 hours. And the honest answer, the only honest answer, to the question of what happens next is that the 3 variables that determine everything are the depth of damage today's strikes inflicted on Iran's missile infrastructure, because a degraded Iranian missile force limits the scope of retaliation, while an intact one means the opening hours of today's exchange have barely begun. Iran's choice between a direct symmetric escalation targeting American bases and Israeli cities, a Hormuz interdiction campaign using mines and fast attack boats against commercial shipping, or a proxy escalation through Iraqi militias, Hezbollah remnants, and Houthi forces that widens the geographic scope without triggering the full American counter-escalation that would follow a direct hit on American personnel, and the Gulf states' collective decision about whether to absorb Iranian retaliation quietly or to formally enter the conflict alongside American forces. And none of those 3 variables are knowable yet, which means the uncertainty itself is already the most powerful economic force moving global markets tonight, because markets price uncertainty as risk. Risk has a cost. That cost is paid first by energy consumers, then by manufacturers, then by every household that buys food, fuel, or anything made or transported using either. And what began in the skies above Tehran this morning is going to be felt in every economy on the planet before the week is over. Economic force moving global markets tonight, because markets price uncertainty as risk. Risk has a cost. That cost is paid first by energy consumers, then by manufacturers, then by every household that buys food, fuel, or anything made or transported using either. And what began in the skies above Tehran this morning is going to be felt in every economy on the planet before the week is over.